Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Fitness Education Series produced by the Australian Fitness Academy. It's like progressive overload for your brain. I'm your host, Tom Rock, and in today's episode, I'm going to talk about split programming a little bit and how often we should train each muscle group. But this podcast comes from an email from a student, one of our current students, Anna. So shout out to Anna. Thank you very much for your email and emails that are coming through. It's great to hear from students, get their questions and thoughts on things. So really excited to get stuck into this episode. So I'll run through Anna's questions and what she sort of discussed in her email, and then I'll sort of break down my response, my answers, and sort of work through the discussion that way. But this is a really good podcast that I think is important to understand, and it takes a lot of the concepts that I've talked about previously in terms of hypertrophy and programming and things like that, and gives you some things to consider when looking to apply it to yourself or to clients. So what Anna has sort of said is she'd like to understand my previous comments in podcasts about repeating split programs twice per week in order to train muscles twice per week, and she'd like me to sort of discuss that a little bit more. Because she said as she's going through the Cert 3, she's currently in the Cert 3 and then we'll move to the Cert 4, as she's currently going through the course, it's not highlighted a lot, and she's previously had coaches that she's only been training once, or muscle groups once per week, and that she does admit that she sort of never had a massive interest in hypertrophy in general, and generally sort of lent towards sort of power and speed training. But she's never sort of, even through her trainers in the past, they've never sort of pushed the idea of doing a split program and then doing it twice per week. So her question is sort of around, so if a client does a split program but just trains each muscle group once per week, is it fruitless? Is there a point to it? Are they getting anything out of it? So very good question, which we'll get to. And then she's also said if they should do a split program and train each muscle group twice per week, should you repeat the exercises, the same exercises twice per week? So if I do an upper body day and a lower body day, for example, should my upper body day be exactly the same twice per week? And that's another great question that we'll get to. So yeah, we'll start with if a client does a split training or a program once per week. Say I do upper body push, upper body pull, and a leg session. It's a 3-day split, but I train that once per week. That's an example. So if I do that once per week, is that pointless? So very great email. I loved reading it, loved responding to it. I love breaking it down. So it's very cool, and it also gets me thinking as well, and looking at I guess different topics and program differently, because when you're looking at research and educating and doing it day in, day out, all we're looking for is teaching the general theories, but it's good to remember that application is going to be different depending on circumstances. So what I sort of touched on first was when we're doing the Cert 3 and 4, there is a brief section on hypertrophy that does mention generally training each muscle group 2 to 3 times per week is going to be ideal for hypertrophy. But it is a brief recommendation, and it's not, I guess the whole course is not littered with that exact information, but that 2 to 3 times per week is really the way to optimize hypertrophy, is probably a good way to put it. So there is, I've got one sort of, I'll put in one research paper in the description that was sort of a review by Brad Schoenfeld in 2016, and he looked at training muscle groups once, 2 or 3 times per week, I believe. I can't remember, but he looked at multiple training different amounts of times per week with the same volume, and what he sort of concluded was that training twice per week promoted superior hypertrophy than training once per week when the training programs had the same amount of volume, sets and reps, for example. So in terms of if someone's goal is hypertrophy, training 2 times per week is going to be better than once per week, and that's sort of shown in the literature quite well generally. But however, Anna, as you have stated in your email and your question basically, is what about once per week? So, and that's a very good point. And not everybody wants to optimize hypertrophy. So, or then not everyone's main goal is hypertrophy. So even though training muscle group twice per week optimizes hypertrophy, you definitely can still increase muscle mass training a muscle group once per week. It might just increase a little bit slower than if you're training or stimulating hypertrophy twice per week, but you can definitely still stimulate muscle growth by training a muscle group once per week. And generally, hypertrophy is a long-term process. It takes time and effort and consistency to build muscle mass. So however you do it, it's going to happen at a very, very slow rate, especially as you get more and more advanced. The rate at which you can build muscle or increase muscle mass is going to be very, very small. So once per week, twice per week, something that is consistent is going to be good, but you can definitely still increase muscle mass training once per week. So depending on a client's goal and the client's schedule, training a muscle group once per week might be perfect. It can also come down to a client's enjoyment potentially as well. So definitely not fruitless to train a muscle group once per week. And as you've stated, you've seen in yourself, you've seen great progression and results training your muscle group once per week, or training a split program and just doing each day once per week. So it's definitely doable, and in the long run with consistency, absolutely you'll still see hypertrophy and resistance training benefits for sure, which is really, really cool. I think the main thing to consider when looking is if a client should train once per week, should they train twice per week? Look at their goal, and we want to look at their goal, whether it is hypertrophy, whether it's general fitness, but we need to look at their training schedule, how it works. Can they train multiple times per week? How many times can they get in the gym? If they can train 3 days a week, should they do full body 3 times a week, or should they do a split upper body push, upper body pull, lower body? And it can come down to a range of factors. It might be based on when they can train. If they can train Monday, Wednesday, Friday, probably full body might be the most optimal potentially, because they can train sort of do less sets but train consistently or more frequently throughout the week. But if they can only train Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, you might have to look at some sort of split program to allow recovery between sessions. So, because if we do full body, we're not going to be able to train resistance, do resistance training 3 days a week. So, if they're only training Monday, if they're training back-to-back days, you have to look at some sort of split program potentially. So they're only going to be able to hit each muscle group probably once per week. So, and that's okay. It's good to know that you can create a program that will work for this client. Potentially after a while, if they decide that their main focus is hypertrophy, then you might have to talk to them about how their schedule impacts their ability to optimize hypertrophy. Let them know they can still do it, and they can still get results. But if they want to sort of progress a little bit faster, or they hit a plateau, maybe trying to hit 2 days a week each muscle group is important. I think training volume is another thing to consider. When it comes to hypertrophy, there's a lot going around about what causes hypertrophy. Is it volume? Is it metabolic stress? What sort of training stimulus is it? Is volume the driver of hypertrophy? Is more volume equal more hypertrophy? All sorts of stuff. Generally, I definitely think there's a ceiling on volume. I don't think it's necessarily the main driver of hypertrophy. So if I do more sets, then I get more hypertrophy. I think there's definitely a limit, and it comes back to recovery and things like that, and how close to failure my sets are, how long my rest periods are. There's a whole lot of things that go into hypertrophy. But I think one thing to consider when analyzing programs or creating a program, whether they're training once per week, twice per week, 3 times per week, is to adjust your volume accordingly. So if a client is training a muscle group once per week, it's probably important to complete at least 3 really good working sets per session, if not 4 or 5, depending on the client's fitness level or their experience, to sort of get that training volume in to stimulate enough hypertrophy for that one session a week. If a client is training each muscle group twice per week, it's probably more beneficial to do maybe 2 or 3 hard sets and then recover and then go again. So because they're doing more sessions per week, they can get away with doing slightly less sets in each workout, and that volume is sort of equated, and they're going to get good stimulus in those 2 sessions, and they don't need to do 5 or 6 sets or 4 or 5 or 6 sets in one session to maximize that hypertrophy. Again, we're talking about optimizing hypertrophy. So if a client just did 3 sets once per week, it may not maximize hypertrophy. They may get a small bit of hypertrophy. They're definitely probably going to maintain their muscle mass, but it can be a little bit harder. So generally that 6 sets per week is sort of where you really see the diminishing returns. After about 6 sets per muscle group, that is, you generally don't see a whole lot of extra hypertrophy stimulus post that. You end up just creating a lot of fatigue that makes it harder to recover and probably harder to build muscle potentially. So generally around 6 sets per muscle group is the maximum, and that's probably from the more advanced lifters. If the client is a beginner and they try to do 6 sets for a muscle group in a session, they're probably going to be quite sore and not really recover. Again, it depends on rest periods, load lifted, and how close to failure a client is training or you're training as well. So lots of different factors go into that. But I think it's a good point is to make is if you're programming for a client to train a muscle group twice per week, they need less stimulus within that each session. But if they're training once per week, probably a couple more sets will help them maximize their potential hypertrophy from that single session. So that's I think something to consider if we're programming around different frequencies. But again, that's for maximizing hypertrophy and something to look into. But yeah, to answer your question, definitely once per week, not fruitless. If a client can get in and train once per week, you want to optimize the stimulus as best you can, but they can definitely still improve that. And a split program once per week might be the way to go. If you can train 3 days per week, but you've got short sessions, you can only train for 30, maybe 45 minutes in the gym. A client can do that. Very hard to do a good full body session in say 30 or 45 minutes, but you could do a good upper body push session in 30 minutes. So you might have to think about scheduling and that, but if I can do 3 30-minute sessions per week, I might decide I'm going to split my program. Might not be 100% optimal for hypertrophy because I'm training once per week, but I can still maintain my muscle and probably still improve my hypertrophy training that once per week. So definitely something to consider for different scenarios. So the next question was in regards to exercise selection for training a muscle twice per week. So let's say I am doing upper body push, upper body pull, and legs, and I'm meant to be in the gym 6 days per week. If I'm training twice per week, would my upper body push program be the same each time, or should I change exercises? And as you sort of stated, you sort of talked about variety in your email, and I think that's a very good point, and it makes sense to me, and probably a lot of clients out there. There's no right or wrong. It does come down to overall program balance and what exercise you select and how isolated your exercises are versus compound exercises like that. But in essence, there's probably no right or wrong. It comes down to the overall program, but I think variety can be important. Variety will help clients stay interested. They won't get bored if they come in and do the same thing twice per week. It may not be as mentally stimulating or motivating for them. Again, some clients are different. If it's for yourself, for example, or for me, sometimes just knowing exactly what I'm doing every time in the gym, it's easy. I don't have to overthink about it. I might have exercises I enjoy, so I'm just going to do them every time. Absolutely fine. Probably good to add variety every now and then, just for general imbalances and things like that. But in essence, if you want to do the same session and the program is well balanced, nothing wrong with that at all. Depends what's involved in the session too. But I think variety can be important to just maintain overall balance, functionality. It allows you to play around with different bilateral exercises potentially and add some variety to improve those imbalances, and it gives you a bit more of a range to play with certain exercises. I think keeping clients interested is really important. But it will depend on the circumstance. There might be times if it's a real beginner client, sometimes keeping the exercise the same is really good for that first sort of 4 to 6 to 8 week block, because it allows them to get good at each exercise. If they're trying to learn 8 to 10 exercises throughout the week, it can take them longer. If they do 4 or 5 exercises and they really start to learn those patterns well, and get coordinated at those ones, it can be more beneficial to do them more frequently to help that learning process. And once they really get good at those initial exercises, then you can start to add a little bit of variety and change around exercises to keep them interested and add more skills and teach them new exercises. So that's a really important thing. But yeah, probably no right or wrong with if you should do the same session or add variety. Up to you as a coach, or as a programming, if you're programming for yourself or for a client. Also, it's good to discuss it with the client as well. See what they like. Generally, it's good to change it if there's blocks of programming, adjust it to add variety and keep them interested. But if there's a lift they like, or an exercise they like, or they've got a real big focus at some point, they go, okay, next 3 weeks or next block I really want to work on my deadlift, I'll probably deadlift twice per week. So if there's any sort of focus of their program, it's good to sort of probably maximize that and do that twice per week. But if we're just sort of talking about stimulating a muscle, adding variety is fine. So if, let's say, I want to focus on bicep hypertrophy, whether I do standing dumbbell curls, or I do preacher curls, or a barbell curl, or single arm cable curl, there's going to be slight variations in terms of stability and maximizing motor unit recruitment and things like that. But in essence, if I'm taking the sets close to failure, they're going to give me relatively similar stimulus for hypertrophy. So I could pick any of those exercises and do a bicep exercise twice per week, and that's going to be absolutely fine. If there's one that I really like, I could stick to that twice per week for 4 weeks, and I wouldn't really be detrimental either way. So another really good question, but a lot to play around with. And that's another reason why I like programming so much, is you can really, there's not a lot of rules, apart from obviously you've got the general principles, exercise order, and all your sort of programming principles that dictate exercise selection and program balance. But there's so much sort of room to play around with different programs, different structures, different progressions, different splits, all sorts of things, to individualize programs for different clients. And I think, like this discussion has gone, it's one of those things where if you train a muscle group twice per week, probably been shown to be sort of, I guess, optimal in terms of maximizing hypertrophy. But a lot of the literature is around optimizing and what's better for hypertrophy than worse. And hypertrophy is relatively slow. So just because twice a week, 2 to 3 times a week has been shown to be better than once per week, that's really good. And if a client wants to work hypertrophy, that's great to know. But if a client's in for general fitness and they've got other goals like fun runs, or it's a general sport goal, might be netball, football, they want to work on that speed, power stuff, then focusing on hypertrophy once per week and stimulating growth once per week is going to be okay if they're trying to fit that around other training sessions and recovering from running or riding or something like that. So lots of other factors come into programming, and that's something to really think about if you are programming for an individual circumstance. And that's why individualization is such a key principle in programming, I think, that gets overlooked with sometimes in social media and things like that. People will just be happy to jump on a program off the internet and give that a try, and if it doesn't work around their lifestyle or their goals, it's not going to be optimal. They're not going to be able to stick to it, and they probably won't see results. But yeah, very cool email, Anna. So thank you for getting in touch. Hopefully that helps and gives you sort of my thoughts on training hypertrophy, optimizing it, training twice per week. And I have said a lot that you should train a muscle group twice per week. And in essence, I think if you are trying to optimize resistance training, it's probably a good thing. But as you've said, and you sort of shown me, there's definitely circumstances where once per week, even though it's not, let's say, optimal in quotation marks, you can definitely still see hypertrophy results from it. So if that's what gets the client training consistently and improving, then that's absolutely a great step, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. So yeah, very, very, very good point. Again, thank you for your email. If anyone else has any thoughts on this or any questions or topics they'd like me to cover, please email tom@afa.com.au. Happy to chat about absolutely anything, programming, nutrition, health, anything, any questions or any topics you've seen, you've got. If you scroll on social media and you see something interesting, send it through or send me your thoughts. Happy to, yeah, discuss anything you guys like to hear about. But other than that, guys, hope you got a bit out of that. Have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you all soon.